Hi, and welcome to another episode of Data Matters alongside my business partner, Steve Wright. Hi, Steve.
Hello.
We have the expert minds today of Helen Rabe. Helen is the Global Security Director at Abcam. Hi, Helen.
Hi, good afternoon, Vicky. Hello, everybody. And I'm just going to be very clear and set expectations. Expert is giving me way too much credit. But thank you.
That's not true.
I honestly don't claim I'm no expert, but I am certainly experienced. School of Hard.
So what we want today is for all of these guys to guide us through the opportunities and challenges brought about by Article 32 of the GDPR, none other than data security. In recent times, following the application of the General Data Protection Regulation over 2 years ago now, and when so many of us are still working at home, I believe that individuals probably have a clearer idea than ever of security and what it means for them in terms of what can happen when things go wrong. But let's turn it over to Steve and to Helen to begin with and start to unpack this. So Steve, can I start with you and ask you, can you take us through what data security actually means in legal terms, please?
Antonis was going to give a wonderful legal definition with far greater depth of legal view of this than I can, but in the absence of him hoping to catch us halfway through the show, I will just talk to Article 32. And before I start, I'll just say this, that and I know we come on to this, for me certainly, as being a cybersecurity professional, as I was 10 years ago, before sort of diving into privacy, the challenge that we had always as cybersecurity professionals was sort of what was the legal ramifications of us not having appropriate security in place. And there wasn't as much around. With the introduction of GDPR, that legal, that basically created that legal, if you like, environment in which to then what we're seeing of all these companies getting regulatory action on the back of Article 32, and there's a whole host of examples I could provide. But the definition of Article 32 is very explicit, and it's interesting because that throughout the GDPR text it talks about the word risk over 120 times, and that's because like with any regulation or law, you have to do a risk-based assessment of what's appropriate and proportionate. And Article 32 is no different. In fact, it says, taking into account the state of art, the cost of implementation, and the scope and nature and context of the processing. In other words, it's saying work out what you do with the data, where you host it, how you access it, etc. And then it's got to be proportionate and appropriate to the risk. And it talks specifically, there are 4 aspects to it. It talks about pseudonymization and encryption, which we're all familiar with. It talks about ongoing confidentiality, integrity and availability, which we know is the CIA, the staple of security. It talks about availability, which so from a business continuity and DR perspective, and then finally, and I think equally importantly, it sets the bar for the testing, assessment, evaluation and effectiveness of those controls. Now for us, Helen and many of us have been in this industry for 25 years. We know that a big part of the challenge that we have is how do you make sure that security is good enough when you've got all of these bad actors out there trying to hack into our systems or to lead us via phishing scams and basically get inside our boundaries. And so it's an ongoing challenge. But in terms of the legal definition, that's it. It's Article 32. There's various other articles and recitals. And really, it for me, what it did was it legalized, if you like, the whole security element, which was a really good thing for both CISOs and for us data protection officers. And the only other thing I'm just going to say is, we can't, as DPOs, we can't survive without security. We have to have constant relationship, constant assurance from the security. We can't deliver privacy without the security. It's an absolute fundamental component of what we do.
Well, that's a symbiotic relationship, right? We can't do it without you either. You're our leverage more often than not.
Thank you, Helen. That's why us DPOs and CISOs work so seamlessly together.
Well, 9 times out of 10, yes. I've seen one or two where there's been a bit of a clash of titans, but yeah, no, absolutely. I'll add to that and say, you know, we obviously know, for me, GDPR leveled the playing field. And by that, I'll be clear. Coming from a financial services background predominantly is my background. Regulated, highly regulated companies were already ahead of the curve on that because they were driven by the regulatory frameworks that were in place. So financial services, HIPAA, all companies affected by that already were one step ahead of traditionally non-regulated companies. Okay, the Article 32 really pushed that out and then said to everybody, I don't care whether you're regulated or not, you will now be regulated. And this mindset shift was a massive thing for a lot of companies, mid-range corporates who suddenly went, okay, what does that actually mean pragmatically speaking? Well, pragmatically speaking, what it means is GDPR is very evidence heavy. Those assurances and controls that Steve just alluded to, those are not just words. They are documented evidence-based outputs that you have to position in the event of a compromise. Should the ICO turn up on your doorstep after a breach, they will ask you for, can we please see the evidence of the risk assessment that you've performed? How did you do secure by design? What exactly did you do? Where are the evidence-based outputs of this? And traditional non-regulated companies, when I left financial services and I moved to these companies, it was like the Wild West. It was like, oh, hi, everything is everywhere. Oh, don't worry about that. This is the way we do it. Yeah, well, you know, we have this thing called GDPR coming up shortly. This isn't going to cut it anymore. You're going to be regulated. And it was pushing that out and forcing the conversation as high as the C-suite to be very clear with them. These levels of risk doesn't get diluted anymore down the food chain. You are now accountable. This is a highly visible, highly transparent system, and it's been put there for a specific reason. It means that this get out of jail free mindset that people have traditionally had when it comes to compromises no longer stands. So, you know, I'll say strong symbiotic relationship between DPOs and security, absolutely. Be very clear that GDPR is evidence heavy. Therefore, you're all regulated. No one falls outside the scope of GDPR, is my understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected on that. But you need to understand, again, that term that Steve kept referring to earlier, proportionality. You don't have to over-engineer this. Focus on a critical asset, fix that. And the most important thing I can say to you as well is, they don't expect you to fix this overnight, but you do need to at least have a plan of action that you can show. It shows goodwill, good intention, and integrity. So even if your plan is going to take you 5 years to get yourself from 0 to GDPR compliance, show them the plan of activity if you are compromised, because that goes a long way to being able to have a confidence-based conversation with a regulator, as opposed to, well, yeah, we're getting there, with nothing to support it. So there you go, my 2 cents worth.
Fantastic, thanks, Helen. And do you think that GDPR, since it's been introduced, has actually made a difference to the level of risk that a business is facing from a security perspective?
I will. Obviously, everything I say here is subjective. So please, and I'm not an expert. I have to put that out there because experts absolutely know this inside out. I don't. I'm a school of hard knocks. See, so I've picked these up. I've done the odd course, but I'll be very clear. I don't believe that it's changed the risk. What I believe it's done is it's made that risk, it's given that risk accountability. And by that, I mean, the risk stays the same, but those impacts and the consequences associated with not mitigating those risks, there are now things to be held to account. That's the change. The risk stays the same for me, but the accountability, the consequences of that risk not being managed in line with the GDPR Article 32, that has a heavier penalty and a heavier price to pay. So yeah.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, absolutely. The accountability piece is really key, isn't it? And just sort of speaking of that, Steve, what about unpacking some of the security challenges that you've witnessed when dealing with breach notification? And maybe we can sort of have a look at, when things do go wrong, the consequences, and a few enforcement cases as well.
Yeah, so I think it's timely. One of my clients has had an incident in the last couple of days. I was drafting a letter to write to the individuals affected late last night, and that's continued this morning at 6 o'clock. So this is a big part of our lives, and what I found that Article 32 and GDPR on the whole has done, is obviously push that accountability, as Helen quite rightly said, from the top down, but also really focused on what is our incident response procedure, and what, when and where do we notify, and to whom. You've got most of our clients, as you know, Vicky, are international global organisations, so there will be different regulators that we would have to notify on behalf of our clients. But my personal sort of approach to all of this is, investigation and containment are two critical elements to the breach process that, as a DPO, I can't do anything until I've got the bare facts about what's happened, how many people have been affected by the incident, and then obviously I can do my risk and my harm calculation to actually look at the individuals and how they've potentially been affected by this. And it's at that juncture that you then advise and make a decision with your incident response board or team, and then even notify. And let's be honest, also, the regulator here in the UK anyway, the ICO, has been inundated, 18,500 notifications or inquiries relating to incidents and complaints, etc. So it's been a victim of its own success, and I think the question here then is one of balance. And if you are coming at it, and bear in mind, when I was at John Lewis, I had both roles, which was sometimes difficult because on one hand, I'm there to try and help and protect the brand and reputation, but on the other hand, as a DPO, I'm there to protect the rights and freedoms of the individuals, and sometimes they're juxtaposed, other times they're in direct conflict with each other. So it's interesting, about how we deal with it, how we contain it, how we investigate, and then we make a decision based on the potential harm to the individual as to whether we notify. And sometimes you don't always notify the regulators. In fact, in a lot of cases, I haven't chosen to notify the regulator. I've just notified the individuals affected. And there's a big challenge here because I don't know if Helen agrees with this, but when you have an incident, there's a little bit of drama associated with it, and a lot of people want to go immediately, it's a breach, it's really bad, it's Armageddon, it's terrible, and I always try to say, whoa, it's an incident until we can determine that it's actually a breach. Have we been hacked? Have we had some data lost, stolen? And what's the extent of that compromise that's happened? In this case that I've just investigated yesterday and written to the people affected is a small incident of people being exposed to the wrong data, and they didn't technically have access to that data, and they saw data they shouldn't have done. So the impact of that is quite minimal. But Helen, sorry.
No. So I'll agree. Security incidents are hyperbolic things, right? Whether the media gets hold of them or whether your internal people get hold of it, everybody just loses their collective minds most of the time. And that you have to really just rein that in. But one of the first things that I do when I move into a new role is I meet with my DPO or the equivalency head of legal, CTO, CIO, and actually all the technical leads to the best of my abilities, and set an expectation. No one, bar the DPO and the head of legal, is ever categorically allowed to classify anything as a breach. The language we will use will be security incident. No one is to call anything a breach, and I'm pretty hard on that, and I'm really emphatic in that communication, and it's incredibly necessary, because under GDPR, if there are compromises and we do have to declare emails or things like that, then the notion of discovery comes into play. Therefore, if everybody's running around just talking about a breach, that language, then I lose control of it, because that means that it's not a security incident. It's getting too much publicity for all the wrong reasons, and then that narrative just tends to take on a life of its own. So setting the bar right from the outset, and the expectation is simply this: only 2 people. And obviously that is with my consultation, right? And my technical team's forensics. We go to you, we'll say, Steve, we believe this can be defined as a breach. But then the DPO and the head of legal agree that, and then the relevant comms come out. The other thing is, and this goes back to our earlier point around the symbiotic nature of this relationship, when it comes to incidents, the world has changed with regards to who gets involved in crisis management exercises. And these days, part of my CIRT, my cyber incidents response team, is my head of comms, my DPO, my head of legal. Right? They are no longer on the periphery, and they should never be, because depending on the nature of your brand, you can get your CEO cornered, and I have seen this happen, by the media in a car parking space, right? It doesn't bring out the best in your CEO, I might point that out, but the media loves to dig into a popular brand. They just love to get their teeth into that. And if you're familiar with the life cycle of a security compromise, a security breach incident, they're extraordinarily fluid events. And I love that people think that we should have the instant answers like that. Oh, that's how they got in. That's what they did. The average dwell time, I think, is 600 and something ridiculous days nowadays. These things are highly complex organisms. In some cases, sure, it'll be a straightforward phishing attack, and sometimes those are pretty apocalyptic. But the challenge you have here is, and the point I'm trying to make, you are not a separate entity to security anymore as a DPO or a data officer. You're a part of that team. And you should not be on the periphery when it comes to incident management, crisis management exercises, or any type of comms narrative as well. There you go.
Thanks, Helen. And yeah, just to sort of build on the point that you were making there around understanding roles and responsibilities, really, in both of those different spheres. Do you think that this is why it's often so difficult for organisations to operationalise these controls that are required under the GDPR for security?
Oh, okay, that's a big beast of a question. So there are so many variables to consider there. And I'll try and keep it short, because I have a tendency not to be able to get to the point. The traditional challenges, the challenges around operationalizing these controls, depends on your organization. If you are a previously financially regulated company, that sort of thing, less issues, I think. I don't know, I could be doing that a disservice. But if you are a company that wasn't regulated before, and you have this massive monolithic infrastructure that's strong legacy based, that's been customized to within an inch of its life, and it's delivering the basic bread and butter of your company, one of the challenges you have around that kind of situation is that we tend to find patching is anathema. And the reason why is because the business just wants to move at this epic, and I use this term, and it gives me the shivers, agile pace, all right? But everybody thinks that which you're moving at such a rapid, agile pace, that those, what we call the basics, and don't confuse basic with being straightforward and easy, because it's not. Those basics don't get to apply. So you get, you've got this rapid environment that's moving like this all the time, being customized. And then you've got security and infrastructure services going, we need that weekend to do these patches. No, I'm sorry, we can't. We've got to do this new version release. We've got to get this to market. And this cadence of patching then starts to create a backlog that eventually you cannot solve the problem, right? So it depends on so many variations and things in a company. The end users, again, if you move into a company where your end users treat data with impunity and have an open sharing environment, even with intellectual property, you are going to have to take time to shift that mindset and get yourself to the point where you've at least got them on board with where you're going. there's no point in throwing them training and what have you if they're not even aware of security and the role that they play in that. So, you know, this is why I say it's a beast of a thing. You've got to look at each company in its own right to understand that, but there are some fundamentals. That legacy position around things that affect patching, a low security awareness in your user population, which means you have to do a cultural shift to get them to adopt security. You know, and those practices that enable security behaviors to become more elevated and more like a muscle memory in the company. So operationalizing, whether it's the process people, the process side, you know, the people, process, tech, operationalizing those, each one comes with its own challenges. And I could wax lyrical about this. Honestly, it's obviously you can tell it's a bit close to my heart.
I think it's, you know, I think you make a fantastic point there, Helen, around, you know, the legacy infrastructure and an organisation that hasn't actually been used to having to deal with the regulator. I wonder just if either of you had a thought on whether, you know, the number of attacks that we're seeing now, attackers actually recognise that and are really exploiting that, knowing that the potential ramifications on the organisation should there be a significant breach are actually going to be so much more if they're holding on to a load of old data pertaining to, you know, hundreds of thousands of individuals.
I'm going to jump in because
sure,
I like the sound of my own voice, don't I, Steve? The attacks that we're seeing at the moment are exploitative, and by that I don't mean in the technical sense. I mean, attackers generally, and this has been my experience, and I'm sure other CISOs have different experience, are like most of us. The path of least resistance is where I'm going to go. I don't want to expend time, energy, and money on something I don't have to, right? So if I'm going to take a situation like our current pandemic scenario, I'm going to look at what drives people at the moment, and it's fear. So I'm going to exploit that vulnerability. How am I going to do that? I'm going to start doing the tried and tested phishing attack method, right? Phishing, with all the best will and intention in the world, technology cannot solve that problem, I don't believe. It can solve a lot of it, but our end user is still going to be, you know, the one who decides whether or not that turns out to be a successful compromise for an attacker or not. Currently, I would say that the legacy position is not what attackers are focusing on. What they're focusing on is fear and exploiting the vulnerability and fear of people in a situation that is currently psychologically beating us all down, okay? They will take advantage of that, and people, we can't trust to the common sense of people because common sense is not a quantifiable thing, right? One man's common sense is another person's stupidity. So the bottom line is, and I'm sorry, Steve, I know that you asked me to behave and I'm trying my best to. Yes. Right now, the attacks, I think, I mean, unless you work in certain industries that are high target industries that have information relating to COVID research and that sort of thing, this at the moment we're seeing an industry-wide is about exploiting people's vulnerabilities in a psychological sense.
So, Helen, as always, it's just a pleasure to hear from you. You know, whenever we get chatting, these conversations go down a whole variety of, you know, rabbit holes, but they're always wonderful. And I often kick myself for not taking a little notebook along with me whenever we meet. It's usually a glass of wine. But
I was going to say that's right.
But the conversation is so enjoyable. Anyway, Vicky, back to you.
There are a few questions coming in, so I think it might be a good idea if we started to have a look at those to begin with, and then if we try and wrap up with, I know, Helen, you started to give us some really good practical advice about what we can actually do to manage this, but we'll come back to that at the end, I think. So let's start at the top, and I think this is one for you, Steve. We're talking about reports to the ICO. How many of those reports to the ICO were valid, and how many were companies just covering their back in case? In my experience in public sector, they have quite a high threshold of when they need to know about a breach.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, and certainly, you know, the ICO have unwittingly not helped our industry, our nascent industry in the DPO space, by sort of saying, you know, because of the unique circumstances we find ourselves in, we're going to kind of take it easy on you. And in fact, Germany are going one step further and calling for a general acknowledgement of the easing of GDPR because of the coronavirus. But I think, you know, there is a little bit of, you know, we used to notify when I was at John Lewis, definitely not as a precautionary measure, but certainly, you know, we didn't really want to do it, but by the same token, we wanted to be transparent and make sure that we had covered ourselves for a variety of different scenarios. You know, so it's a little bit case by case, is what I'm saying. I certainly wouldn't endorse anyone just blanket notifying, because, you know, you're gonna get the scenario of cry wolf. And you don't really want to be in that situation. You've got to also, the point there, Vicky, is that, you know, use your regulator. The ICO are particularly good, and obviously, you know, there's recent cases in the Nordics with Norway fining and Spain. Maybe it's slightly different there, but certainly the ICO are particularly proactive in their wanting you to talk to them. And so we used to talk to them. I mean, we had account takeovers, we had hacking, we had all sorts of horrible situations at John Lewis, which is just the normal course of being online or being in business now. And it was I was grateful to have phone a friend at the ICO. You know, I've developed some good relationships down there, and I think they understand that sometimes these situations are outside your control. And I think it's better to have a proactive conversation with them rather than just keep reporting, is my point.
And this one possibly for both of you. It's easy to think about the way legitimate security risks can impact the ease of exercising rights by data subjects. But have you seen examples of how security, state of the art, or any type of art, can be used to facilitate and promote the exercise of rights? Or should it always be assumed that appropriate security will always add friction into the rights journey?
That is a really interesting question, and honestly, I need time to unravel it and process it. So help me understand the notion of rights here, Steve, in the context of this question. We're talking data subject rights, right? So I don't know if I'm interpreting this correctly, but have we seen where a security solution or security can help identify these subjects? So when we have to do the data discovery and find this individual and pull it out. I personally have not had any experience in that, to the point, I mean, I've seen people in my previous role, I saw people, the moment GDPR went live, we got hammered with a whole bunch of, you know, subject right requests for the most spurious of reasons. And often, you know, the reasons were people had felt victimized at work. They felt they'd been bullied, and then they were leaving, or they had to leave. And now under GDPR, they felt that GDPR justified and condoned their, you know, them asking for all emails or chats related to their, you know, their name, that sort of thing. But you know, we didn't humor that. But I'm sorry, I haven't had any experience in finding that myself, and I certainly don't know of a security solution, state of the art or otherwise, that could do that.
Is there such a thing as state of the art? I think, you know, in our world of constant keeping up with, you know, the criminals have got the biggest advantage over us, and that's time. You know, they have the time, they don't work 9 to 5. You know, so they're constantly looking, and motivation, right? They're motivated to get into our systems for the data. So, you know, I don't know, I'm a bit with Helen on this. Like, what I will say is there are a whole plethora of tools which help you monitor and manage, you know, so if on no particular tools, but if you've got really good understanding of where your data is, you've got data mining tools, you've got redaction tools so you can fulfill some of those rights requests, then I can see certainly a combination of different existing tools that could be utilized to help with expedite and make that part of an easier service. If you look at your SEAM or your SOC, you've got people, very qualified people, in fact, very experienced, qualified people looking for patterns of activity. So arguably you could use similar people with similar skill sets to then be helping with some of those fulfillments, but typically certainly for the rights, we segregated it into employee rights, so disgruntled employees asking for a data subject access request, and customer, and very often they were hidden. They weren't, customers don't have a habit of going, oh, by the way, I would like my right to be forgot, or right for erasure. They sort of put it in text, so you're left guessing as to what exactly they want. They're just complaining and saying, don't ever contact me again, or something like that. So it's a tricky question, actually. But...
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading the question. I mean, I guess I've had the ability to kind of sit there and read it over again since you two were both talking about it. And I think it kind of seems to apply that if security is there and the risks are being mitigated, then it makes it harder for an individual to enact their right. That's the way that I read the question, and maybe Chad can come back and confirm whether or not that's what you meant. Anyhow, let's move on. Where is the biggest data security risk from, and how can we address this?
That's a loaded question.
There are several answers, Helen, to that one.
Such a loaded question.
I promise I never sent that one.
Kudos to the person who asked that one. Again, subjective opinion. Where do I think the biggest data, so the data security risk? Most of us would say that our insiders and their behaviors pose the biggest risk to our data. And in saying that, let me be very clear and unequivocal in this. That does not make them the problem, right? The problem is not theirs and theirs alone. It's, they do not stand apart from us. If you're in security and you call your insiders your weakest link, I would challenge you on that, because we have to, as security leaders, shift the mindset here, all right? Why are our insiders still our biggest threat? What are we not solving? Technology cannot solve all these problems. And our insider, if you look at data breach reports over the last 5 years, you'll see that the insider threat position continues to trend upwards, and pretty much all the other stuff almost has a static little heartbeat line, because technology can mitigate a lot of that. But we know that, with these lovely technological marvels and the like, that people will send themselves emails that they shouldn't be sending to their home addresses and things like that, and you can put security controls in place, all right? But one thing that's become apparent to me in the last few years, as I've become closer and closer to my user group, and I've been fortunate because I've moved from a group of about end user population of about 2,000 people to 40,000 people to now 1,500 people. I now have a manageable portfolio of end users globally, and I can get closer to the coalface with them. And the one thing that has become really apparent to me is that security tends to assume a great deal on the behalf of the end user. All right, they don't get security, most of them. They get security in a little bubble because it affects them personally, and then they'll operate in that personal bubble. But on a professional level, they believe that security is my problem, not theirs, right? So that insider position and that risk, they don't believe they're the risk. They believe it's me not doing my job because, I'm not solving that risk. So I'd say it comes from the insider, but I would say make sure that you're not part of that problem as a security leader. Build up a really strong program of awareness with your insiders. Teach them to understand that when you say something like security is everybody's problem, honestly, that's a platitude and it's meaningless. Why is it everybody's problem? Explain to your users why the controls that you're bringing in, why they add value. What do they do for your end users? And help them understand that their behavior isn't acceptable because of the implications associated with it. They don't get it. I did a talk recently on the spectrum of hackers, and by that I mean the color spectrum, the black, the white, and the gray. Those are fine. Those are three. But we now have reds. We have we have red hats. We've got green hats, and we've got blue hats as well. And I broke that down and introduced it as, this is the universe of the attacker that I face off to. These are the people who have, malicious intent, and in some cases even grey hats, and want what we have. And most people had never heard of the concept of a black hat and a white hat. They didn't understand it. They also didn't understand the motivations behind those categories, all right, and what drives these people. So instead of keeping them away from you and then blaming them for being a problem, bring them to the fore, meet them, have a meeting of minds. You've got to have a relatable hook, all right? Otherwise, they won't engage with you, and they will continue to be your biggest threat because they don't get their skin in the game.
Thanks, Helen. That's really well articulated there. I think we've probably only got time for one last question. And it's another question for you, Helen. It says great webinar, thanks. So that's all good. The person would like to hear from you about your first responder team to triage new incidents and the escalation process for serious incidents. So
my team is fairly new, and we're building that up. But I also have an MSSP. So the triage comes through my third party into my first line team, my incident team, my security analyst, and my security service delivery manager. And here's a role that isn't widely used in the security world, but it's one I can't live without, right? Depending on the size of your organization, you cannot necessarily justify an incident response lead, right? You don't have 40,000 end users, you've got 1,500 globally. So your team is going to have to be lean. I have a security service delivery manager. That SDM acts as my incident response lead in the event of an incident, right? And she is responsible for helping my analyst triage. Right? Is it going to be a serious blow up in our face, and do we need to get all hands on deck and kick off our process for serious escalation? Or is this something that we manage behind the scenes? And basically my security SDM, her judgment is impeccable. The first thing she'll do is she'll pull all the facts together that she's got, she'll bounce it on me and go, unless it's one of those glaring, this is what we call SEV 1, and really there's just no blurred lines here, this is a serious problem, and we know that we'll stand up our escalation process and kick our response team into play. If there's nuance, then she'll pick it up, she'll triage it, she'll bounce off, and she'll come to me very quickly and go, here's the facts, what do you think? And if it's only a sort of a SEV 2 and it's sitting in that middle ground and we're still waiting on further feedback, she manages the cadence of information coming in from the various parties involved. She collates that, and if she starts to feel at any point that this is going to tip over into SEV 1, she sets expectations with me the whole way through that triage of information and that middle ground. If it's going to tip into a SEV 1 where we know we're going to have to let everybody know, our process is there, and we have two clear channels of communication. One is the technical channel. And what we do on the technical channel is we protect our first line and our analysts. This is where the guys are going to have to get, into the detail and fix it. And I don't know how many of you experience this, but sometimes, and Steve alluded to this earlier, when everybody runs around like lunatics and everybody wants everything and all the information, these people can't do their jobs because they're just being hammered for information from the CEO, the CIO, the chief risk officer. Everybody's just hammering them, right? We protect them. And we protect them by setting up a second communication channel, which the security service delivery manager now immediately becomes the incident response lead or incident response manager. She manages that second line. That's where the governance of the life cycle of the incident is going to be managed, right? So that's where everybody can come and hammer us for questions. All these questions that our C-suite or senior leaders, they go to that channel. And we open it up and they're already on the distribution. And so we contain the narrative, we control the narrative to the best of our abilities. And obviously I'm there and acting with them all the way through. But I have a security service delivery manager, and I'm hoping this answers the question, who manages that subtlety and that nuance before it tips into a SEV 1, so we can always know where we stand and we get the right people engaged, and we do have the right level of resilience planning, and that's your incident response team. We're working on getting our crisis management exercises set up. We have the right levels of communication, and we have the right artifacts to support us, as well as the right forensics teams. So, yeah.
Great, Helen, thank you. Great advice. I'm sure that'll be really helpful to anybody that's listening, whatever the size of the organisation. I think it's probably a good idea for us to try and pull together what good looks like in the whole space, just to round us off. I know it's often hard to do. Helen, you've already given us some fantastic advice and a lot really to think about in this area. But maybe it's kind of your top 3 or your top 5 things that DPOs and CISOs can do to work together to make sure that they're doing the best they can for the organisation around data security.
You know, it's when I saw this question and I did my opening salvo to you was, please, for the love of God, don't ask me this question, but there you go. Difficult one, right? So for me, what good looks like when it comes to DPOs, data privacy officers, the data privacy office, and whether it's risk or what have you, is this. First of all, you have to know your risks, all right? You have to have a clear, as a DPO, have a clear understanding of your risks, work very closely, be on the steering group, because our DPO is on our steering group of the security risk register. Understand the risks, right? And your third parties as well in particular, understand the risk associated with your third parties. And here's why. A lot of those third parties can be legacy third parties with long-standing contracts that you haven't evaluated. They're not held to account for any SLAs. You don't do any penetration testing on them, and you don't know your exposure. So absolutely get your finger on the pulse of your risk with your security lead. Work really closely with them. Right. They're going to help you to be able to map out that risk, understand the exposure, and then you can start to pull the gaps together to get you to a known position. So you need that. Get your risks. So good to me is, first of all, the DPO and the security lead or CISO work hand in glove. You understand the risk and you understand what points matter to you the most about that risk and where your accountability sits with it. The second is you are never on the outside of that relationship. You can at times even go native on that team if you have to. Be a part of, just be an extension of the security team. All right. Don't let your security lead not engage with you proactively. If you have to seek them out and find them, by all means. It's an unusual dynamic because most people tend to turn the other way when they see us coming. But by absolutely good means, you have a strong matrix relationship with your security team. You have to. You're not mutually exclusive. All right. You have to understand as well within that, you know, what are the expectations of you in a crisis? If there's an ongoing security incident, what's your part to play? So you need to be part of that. And I think then the other one is, last but not least, and it goes back to risk. Understand who's accountable for the risk and be clear about this with your C-suite. Now, a lot of CEOs do not understand that the security risk that's raised does not belong to the security lead. It doesn't. It belongs to the owner of that risk, who happens to most of the time be in the business. So be absolutely clear and support and have a strong alliance with your security manager. Speak the same language when it comes to the risk, and speak that language to your CEO so that they absolutely understand when the time comes and something does go catastrophically wrong, right? You have been very clear from the outset, you don't own that risk. Your oversight from a security standpoint, you're there, you're creating the awareness, you're pushing for a mitigation plan, and your DPO is alongside you having that conversation at the same time. But absolutely, the two of you need to have the same conversation and the same narrative and be clear with your C-suite. This risk does not belong to either of you. Because if you don't do that, I mean, yeah, it's a given for most of us CISOs. When there is a security compromise, we expect our heads to roll. Even if we've done all our due diligence and been clear about where the risk accountabilities sit. But if you don't set that in advance and you don't set that expectation, you will fall on your sword. So I would say that those three things are what good looks like for me. If you get the balance on that right, you're in a pretty good place.
Excellent, thanks, Helen. I think it's particularly important around the risk ownership and risk management discussion for sure. Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, only just a couple, because Helen, as usual, has done a wonderful job and fantastic insights. Thank you again, Helen. Just building on the risk. Once you've done your risk, I would say the discovery part of knowing where your data is the single biggest thing from a DPO perspective. You'll want to know, because you need to understand categorically what the lawful basis of processing is, and you need to be able to answer that for your records of processing and for other artifacts. The second is sort of to what you were saying earlier, Helen, and that's about working together, collaborating, because there are multiple other functions such as procurement, loss prevention if you're in retail, and there's a lot of convergence going on across these different sectors. And then what I was already going to say, third party, because third party, you know, every organisation I work with hasn't looked at the contracts for a number of years potentially, and they don't really understand that the contract has evolved and the level of access that's now been granted to those individuals is very different from what it was 2 or 3 years ago. So I would just say, to top all of that, the single biggest thing I would say to anyone listening is around culture, and obviously privacy culture is a little bit of a plug there in the business of embedding that culture of privacy and security. So that, you know, those are the things for me that if I was back in the driving seat, as Helen is, and most of our listeners in fact, would be, you know, just adding to Helen's list, there would be what I would advise and what I would say good looks like.
Yeah, all salient points, couldn't agree more.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and thanks Helen for taking the lead chair. Unfortunately, Antonius was unable to join us today, but I'm sure we'll bring him back on the show at some point in the near future. Helen, again, thank you for your time. We've really enjoyed listening to you today. Is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with before we sign off?
No, look at Steve. I don't think I can compete with that. So no, I mean, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much for your time and help. And you know, I appreciate the opportunity. As always, Mr. Wright, it's been an absolute pleasure.
As always.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Helen.
All right, you're welcome. Take care, everybody. Be safe.
Well, don't forget next week, Vicky, just to let everybody know, as I'm on focus, next week we've got retention and deletion with Steve Bond from Open University and Robert Bond. So 2 Bonds make 007, I think, from Bristow's LLP, both experts on retention and deletion. So we'll be looking to unpick the lawful side of that, or the legal side of that, as well as the practical side, and Steve's got some great insights at his role at Open University.
Excellent. Well, take care, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Vicky, and
Bye.
Thank you.